welcome everyone once again. This is Binglesh Gundara from Pitch Camp. Pitch Camp is an initiative, to help early stage and growth stage entrepreneurs and sales teams to share their ideas with the world better. So we do coaching, the sales coaching boot camps, to bring in the go-to-market strategies and how do you sell, right? The entire 360 degree of B2B sales. So that's our primary focus. So today we have our wonderful guest, Lalit Bise. Welcome, Lalit.
Hi, Vinesh. Thanks for inviting.
Sure. So Lalit is a successful entrepreneur, with his technology venture Byzom.in, and they are now the number one retail intelligence platform. I've seen Lalit's growth since 2013 that we first met at NPC NASCOM Product Conclave as volunteers, and I've seen his company grow and expand. And he has some amazing insights and stories on how do you sell in India, what's his jugaad strategies that he did, cost effective ways in which they were able to grow. So these are some of the insights that I wanted to bring Lalit's story to our platform, and and help entrepreneurs to get some insights of this journey, right? So Lalit, talk to us a little bit about your background prior to Byzom, and what really made you to get into Byzom, and today's focus will be on focusing on your entire sales tactics, strategies, and how did you grow your teams, and so on and so forth, focusing on the retail side.
Right. So sure. So thanks for the introduction, Biblesh. I don't think I'm anywhere close to being successful, like you mentioned, or I think there is a far larger journey ahead of us. Hopefully, we will make it. And I think that's the first thing about entrepreneurship. If any one of you are listening, it's not a 2 year, 3 year, or even 5 year journey. It's more like a 10 year, 15 year, 20 year journey. So if you're signing up for success, you better be ready to wait for those 15, 20 years that you need to even see a semblance of, so to say, success. And if you are doing that, then it's great. So about me, I'm born brought up in Mumbai, computer science grad. Worked in corporate for about 8 years. Started my career as an embedded programmer. Eventually, was a program manager in a semiconductor company. So basically, a through and through techie. I love to code. Somewhere in 2006, I felt I'd been there, done that in corporate life. I thought I had a brilliant idea in terms of how to change the world. So I quit my job and started out on my own somewhere in 2007. The parent company Mobizy Technologies, it's a parent company of Bizome, Mobizy Technologies, was incorporated in 2008. As it turned out, our world-changing idea did not really change the world, though we got a lot of kudos and recognitions. It was a product looking for customers rather than product made for market. I would put it that way. So two failed attempts at building businesses later, somewhere in 2012, we came across this concept or thought process of Bizome. Bizome, as we call it, is the retail intelligence platform. It's an enterprise SaaS solution aimed towards consumer companies or consumer product goods companies who reach to their consumers through mom and pop or kirana as a channel. So that essentially means the consumer companies who are distributing or selling in emerging markets. That's the primary focus of customers. Since 2012, so we raised our seed round in 2013. We turned profitable in 2015. Continue to be profitable. We raised another round, actually another two rounds. Last one
Right.
about a month back, uh, and but that is mainly to fuel or fund the growth. We have been named as the fastest growing tech company in India, like last 4 years. The fastest growing APAC. So growth has been fairly okay for us over last 3 4 years. Fairly good, I would say. We obviously aim to continue that in going. We're about 180 people team. We're headquartered in Bangalore. We branch offices in Mumbai and Delhi, and in one in UK as well. So that's a very high level introduction to Bizo. Uh,
Fantastic.
uh,
So how did you zero in on retail, and in this particular segment?
Right. This happened through a chance meeting. So, as I mentioned, throughout my journey for the two failed attempts at building startups, one of the things that we set out for ourselves when we were looking for product ideas was to around three constraints. So we put ourselves around three constraints. We said we will build for India. Number one, being in India, we understand Indian consumers or Indian prosumers better. So instead of trying to sell it to US where we don't have enough understanding of the users or the market, we will try and build a product for India. Second, we said we will build for mobility. Throughout my life, I had work on mobile. I always believed the world is going to be mobile first. It just happened that somewhere in 2014, world became
Right.
mobile. But since year 1999, I always believed that world is going to be mobile first. So mobility was a common sense. And third thing we said enterprise simply because we felt at that time that enterprise were far more monetizable from a mobility point of view compared to direct consumer. So we said we will start looking at ideas around India enterprise mobility. I went around and met about 400 random people through my LinkedIn network. That's another thing I had learned over those two, three failed attempts. Is essentially to be fearless, go and call and meet. Being a coder, I could create some, demos or prototypes for them to show. I met people from variety of industries. I met people from insurance, finance, real estate, pretty much every logistics, survey companies. I met pretty much everybody across the ecosystem. One of the things that I learned out of that was the consumer companies essentially are data blind to the largest of the extent. They have no idea, especially when they work in this mom and pop retail, was where they had completely blind to what's happening in the market. They were making decisions basis guesswork and experience and factors like that. And they missed that quite a lot. So that seemed like an opportunity. That opportunity was also validated by the fact that five of them, just on a PowerPoint and you know badly working demo, they signed up and gave me 5 lakh rupees each as an advance, saying that
Oh,
if you buy this
interesting.
product, I will pay for it. So that kind of validated the need as well. I mean, people had so much of a need that they were ready to pay in advance. So that was another part that kind of validated the market for me. And so that they kind of seed funded the whole. So I mean that's a funny sales stories. I think Bizom started with me selling first and then building product. And yeah, so we sold it to those five guys. Those gave me the seed money to build a product. We build a product, and then on it just went like that.
Fantastic. So this is one of the very highly read about stories in every content that how even a diagram or an initial markup can help you acquire your first paying customer. So great to see a live example that you were able to do that in India as well.
Absolutely. And if you're a programmer, you have an added advantage because then you can actually code a demo. I mean, at that time, I think we had three. I was the 1.5 people team in Bizo because rest of the guys were busy paying rent and stuff. It was me and another half guy who were working on Bizo. So we had to do everything. We had to code, we had to demo, we had to sell, we had to do everything, iterate, and all of that. And I think so. If you can code, that is phenomenally advantageous in that stage, because then you can actually give a sense of realism to your product to the end customer compared to let's say a prototype on a PowerPoint. A customer
Right.
can actually touch and feel and play with that kind of a stuff. So if you can code, it's a great advantage. Yeah.
So how did you move? Did your past two failed attempts at running businesses help you build a very strong sales mindset coming from a tech background or from a coding background?
Look, I'm still a developer at heart, and I like every developer at heart. I typically hate sales. I mean, and hate sales and salespeople together, right? So you have a perception about sales teams that they are hustlers, uh, they are prone to fib, they are prone to stretch the truth, and to generally think it's a so nobody likes to interact with customers, right? So even today I struggle with my engineering teams to say, look, you need to interact with customers more, and they hate interacting with customers. They would love to look at data and they would love to look at algorithm. It's There are two parts to it, right? So as a developer, you need a constant, like, I mean, I like to. I don't think development is that different than many other works, but you need that constant 4 hour, 5 hour concentrated work. And that time, taking a customer call or getting in
Right.
a is a distraction. And I understand that particular mentality in general. And it was not very different for me. And that's how I think that my first two products ended up being far more tech oriented, where I said, okay, I'll build the greatest tech in the world, or greatest product in the world, and let my product speak for itself in terms of getting markets and acquires and stuff like that. What I realized about that is, while it was the greatest tech, so we believe we invented hybrid mobile application in world. We are the first ones to do that. Very proud of it. It did not make any difference to the world because it was either ahead of time, but it was not built for keeping a user in mind. It was not built for with a deeper understanding of user. And so I had to change that particular mindset. I think by the time third time I could get myself to change that mindset to even understand the pain and then build tech around it. So initially building sales teams is a must for a techie, especially for himself to do sales. So I don't know how to do sales. Even today I say that I don't know how to do sales. But it's also very powerful, and today we know that it's very powerful if you are a developer and if you are able to talk to customer, because then you are able to bridge those parts very easily. I could find for the complex, most of the problems that customers felt that they had, I could find the simplest of a solution in the quickest of the time instead of going through hoops. A traditional sales guy would go through multiple hoops of saying, look, I need to get a quote from it, I need to do solutioning, I need to do this, I need to do that. As a tech guy, you could essentially say, look, here is an alternative. This will happen quicker and better for you as a customer. So you're solving the customer biggest pain point in a fastest enough time. From that point of view, our entire sales team is of engineers. And that's one of the things that I learned from that is that it's important that you bring an engineering mindset also to sales. At least for me, it worked. Almost all of us. So it's essentially, if you are from a sales background or if you have prior sales experience, we typically don't hire people in sales. We prefer people who have either been entrepreneurs themselves or engineers in their prior life and want to move to do sales. I think that is the general hiring strategy been for last 7-8 years, and I think it has worked phenomenally for us.
Fantastic. So outside of this, initial prototype Jugaad, that you were able to sign up your few customers. So talk to us about some of the initial sales strategies that worked and that didn't work, and how did you go ahead and acquiring customers?
Sure. So it's not Jugaad, we call it algorithmic Jugaad.
Right.
Two reasons for that. So algorithmic Jugaad is like Mangalyaan. So Jugaad, as you call it, is a frugal innovation done at a periphery. And algorithm is a way to scale that innovation.
Yeah.
And as we were discussing backstage, what happens is in early stage startups, and it happened with us as well, we did that mistake. We are extremely intense about your product. You are reading a lot, doing a lot of research, talking to a lot of fellow-minded entrepreneurs, and just very inward looking, trying to come with something that is brilliant. I don't think innovations happen like that. Innovations typically happen at a periphery, like you said, like we were discussing, at a customer end, for example, right? But not all innovations are scalable in general. An engineering or algorithmic mindset is essentially to figure out what innovations that work and to scale the hell out of it. And that's why we call ourselves as algorithmic Jugaad company. One of the interesting thing for that is that you essentially hire entrepreneurs. I mean, we have almost more than 1/3 of our team is entrepreneurs, ex-entrepreneurs, successful or otherwise. We just love working with entrepreneurs across industry. So now initial time, we did everything. So one of the first things I said, I went and met about 400 odd guys. I did cold calling. So once we decided we are going to go into CPG, I went, did a cold calling. I did multiple other stuff. To be honest with you, none of it worked. I mean, personal resilience. We even so in India SME, if you know, we have this. In India SME, even if a guy is a owner of a 10 crore worth company, he wants customized product. He's like, oh, मेरा वाला pink, वो वहाँ पे ना वो color वहाँ पे वो change करो, or that alignment change it here. Everybody wants a customized product, even if they don't have any budgets to back that up, right? So fairly hard. Interesting discovery around that time was, as I told you, the story of about first 5 customers. The other story about that is about a year down the line, we ran out of that money. We ran out of our seed funding as well. So we went back to those first 5 customers, said, look guys, we have been working hard towards making this successful for you. and but that meant that we couldn't invest in sales or marketing. So we don't have any other customers on our platform yet. Can you help us get some more customers? Fortunately, those customers were so happy with us that they said, look, I'll give you those. So we actually got our first 50 customers were all references from those first five customers. So their industry contacts. So for example, one of my first customer was an ex-Coke guy. So he because of his Coke background, he could find at least 20 other people in the industry who could get me. I remember a visit when this guy came with me for a customer visit in Pune. So he flew along with me as a part of my sales team, and he personally made that sales for me for a Pune based company. We had those very how do we call it, very loyal customers, and most of them are still our customers. So and that helped us to generate the next lead pipeline. So now I think that is another thing, that once you have that, I mean, in retrospect, I can say that while I did not know it at that time, retrospect, I put that sales process as follows: try to sell on PPT. I mean, when I say PPT, I'm exaggerating it. A demo or a prototype actually works far better. So try and sell on PPT to first five customers. Those five customers, pivot them to get your next 25. If you can do that, that means you have some semblance of product market fit and essentially the sales. So this is not a classic sales process, by the way, if you
Right.
realize.
Right.
It is about just leveraging, realizing that your strength is your happiness of your existing customer, and now the existing customer cannot pay you more because you have got out of their budget. How else can they pay you? Can they pay you through a reference? Can they pay you through a testimonial? If even if you look today, I mean, we focus a lot of our sales energy on the customer success, as we traditionally call it, but a lot of it is so majority of our sales, a lot of it goes into just this customer success, ensuring that customers are successful, and hence they are selling on our behalf to other customer
Right.
as much as possible. And I think that's a different sales strategy, but it worked for us. At least in India, where word of mouth is a very very big thing.
Right. Interesting. So, how much, because you are a mobile first, technology solution, right? One, adopting such a technology would have also been faster from an end user point of view.
Yeah.
How much of this led to certain, complications or challenges on the backside when you had to deal with India's mystical, retail distribution challenges?
Sure. So two parts. Okay. So you know, fortunately, this was a pure luck. Okay. When we started, there was no the smartphone penetration in India was very dismal. Uh, the tendency of our enterprise customers to look at cloud was fairly negative,
Right.
and it looked very hard in terms of how this mobile first cloud solution is going to work in a India kind of a geography. Fortunately, somewhere in 2014, this whole 3G thing came, and it kind of changed. The data pricings went in India completely downwards. So by the time we had our first 25 customers, apart from our customer references picking up, some of the ecosystem stuff changed quite a lot. The Android phone started becoming sub
Super.
5,000,
You're right.
and data became almost free. So you had like unlimited data packages at 250 rupees and stuff like that. So that limited, or rather that solved this adoption issue for us in a lot of ways. I mean, as I said, this was just a lucky this thing, not something that we planned before. I mean, I can always go back and say I was visionary and I knew that, but to be brutally honest, I did not know it. It just worked, and so those helped us to get that adoption and other stuff. Third thing that helped us during the journey is WhatsApp. I mean, WhatsApp being so ubiquitous, every guy, every sales executive, every distributor, every retailer has a smartphone and a WhatsApp right now, and that curve just went far faster than our curve. That growth curve of adoption was always ahead of our curve of adoption. So it was very, so first 3 years I had a lot of trouble explaining to and brands used to give smartphones or tablets to their sales executives. So it used to increase to their TCO, or total cost of ownership, because they would have had to sponsor the smartphones for sales guys. So I would have had a lot of trouble convincing them that why do they need to invest in devices and data to get this particular information market insight. Somewhere in 2014-15, the all BYOD stuff started picking up really well. That reduces the cost of ownership for them automatically. They started convincing me that look, don't worry about data, and like we will let's deliver video, let's capture video, let's capture audio, because then data is almost free and stuff like that. So this adoption and other stuff, actually, apart from us consciously doing some effort for it, I think the rest of the ecosystem kind of stuff work. One of the other things that worked for me, though, I mean, just slightly digressing from your question, Bimlesh, and I forgot to mention it in your last this thing, was this whole, we call it as an inch wide, mile deep kind of an approach. So I'll give you a story. I mean, this one you know
Sure.
actually. This is, I mean, I can't take the names because we're going to put it up on YouTube. But this person, this gentleman is a prolific angel investor and ex chairman of NASCOM. Uh, so I had a chance meeting with him. When I was looking for seed funding, I had a chance meeting with him. I was looking for seed funding, and he met up with me in a coffee shop in Bangalore. And I explained him my business plan. At that time, we were so early. We were doing everything apart from smartphones. We were doing these Java phones. We were doing these custom devices also as a mobile first strategy that you mentioned, because that time smartphones weren't prolific. So we were using that. If you would have seen those custom devices, there's long form. I don't know. Now only the bus conductors carry it.
Right.
Previously, a lot of people used to carry it. Those were handheld devices and those Java phones and stuff like that. We used to try and build our solution for all of them. So I explained him my business, my product, and I explained him my GTM, go to market strategy, sales strategy. And I was like, I have 3 leads in Delhi, and I have 2 leads in Mumbai, and 5 leads in Bangalore, and all of them are great, and this is how I'm doing it. So he told me this, and it has made an impression on me, and that has been our mantra so far. He's saying that, Lalit, it's better that you have a 10% market share in Kormangla than having, let's say, a 1% market share or one customer in each of the towns in India. Because 10% market share in Kormangla tells me, by the way, for those who don't know, Kormangla is a small area in Bangalore. So 10% market share in Kormangla is far more valuable in terms of reducing your cost of sales. The same thing is about the product, saying that, look, the product, you should just pick one, whatever you think is futuristic. So if you think smartphones are futuristic, just pick one and put all your energy in. Essentially saying, bring focus very early down, bring focus. Don't do everything because everything looks green. Uh, that changed our sales strategy quite dramatically. We went all in on this smartphone strategy, and we said we need to get 10%, 20% market share in Bangalore before we even talk to Mumbai based customer or a Delhi based customer. This razor sharp focus essentially over those next 2, 3 years gave us so many, the references testimonials become so easy, because now if in Bangalore, if there are 500 people who are using my solution, bringing another customer and getting him on a market visit to see him, okay, look, this guy is also using it, is far
Yeah.
easier for me to do. So that built a network effect fairly well for us. Then we obviously applied the same to Mumbai, to Delhi. Now when we are in overseas, we are applying the same. We call this as an inch wide, mile deep approach. So you pick your inch and dig
Deeper.
really, rather than trying to get one customer each everywhere, especially in very early stages. And whatever your inch could be wrong, but then that's a risk you run. But if you try to spread yourself too thin, you are doomed for failure, so to say.
Fantastic. Excellent. So, at what stage, in this journey, after about 25 odd customers, did you actually look to start scaling your sales teams and processes?
Right. So as I told you, there are two. By then, by this 25 customers somewhere in 2014, by then the overall, how you call it, culture of a business was starting to form. Right. So these 2, 3 things: there's this razor sharp focus on the inch wide, mile deep approach, and the whole customer success, in the sense that my existing customers are my biggest asset, so to say.
Right.
That has started forming, and that's also easy position to take. If you look at it by tech background, it's easy position for me to take. I will make my current customer so happy that I don't have to do cold calls. So my only thing in life was, I had done so many cold calls by then, and I hated doing cold calls. And I was like, boss, look, is there anything else we can do apart from me personally doing cold calls, because I just hated it. I mean, it was very bad experience for me. I could never master it, so to say. So There was a one another story which is a transforming story for Bizome at that point in time,
Sure.
right? So we had this new gentleman. He's also an ex-entrepreneur. Just joined us, and I took him to a. So he had joined us as a part of our sales slash customer success team, and there was a big customer escalation. There was like a customer who was screwing us, like this is wrong, this is not working, blah blah blah. So I took him to that meeting and said, "Ki chalo, aaj na today you get screwed. I mean, every day I get screwed. Today you also get screwed." So I said, "Come, let's go for this meeting." Okay. So this gentleman went along with me for this customer meeting. This customer, as I mean usual, he liked our product, but he had a lot of areas for improvements. He was like, look, yeah, this has to work, this has to work like this has to. He had like 500 suggestions and improvements on the product. He was crying. This gentleman, this friend of mine, or rather this colleague of mine, who he wrote down everything like judiciously. He just went and wrote down all the notes around it. He made a 3-page notes around it. Okay. And when they stopped, then he asked back the customer, look, I will fix all of these things in a time bound manner. But can you change your minimum user guarantee from current 50 to 500? What's the motivation for me? At that time, let's say we were charging him whatever, 1,000 rupees per user. So there's 50 customers would pay me whatever, 50,000 rupees. So he's like, look, for 50,000 rupees, why would I do all this effort? But if you are going to pay me 5 lakh rupees a month, I would happily do that. So can you give me a commitment that I give you a project plan for fixing this, and in return, you give me you increase my user guarantee by 10x. So you increase the account size by 10x. And the guy did not even blink this thing and said, yes, of course. Okay. And this was a big revelation for me. So as a developer, like, I mean, we joke internally saying that as a developer, you don't ask money for fixing bugs. Just never. So your heart says that, look, this is my problem and I need to fix it. And it's so inward focus and saying, I need to improve my product and do so much of work. Only then customers will come. But here was a guy who was going and telling customers straightforward that I agree that my product needs to improve, but for Arjun. So that kind of changed the way we used to think about sales in general as an organization, and it happened because of some external influence. So today onwards, that became the basis of our what we call it as customer success, right? So then we have a lot of stories in that where somebody charged customer for upgrade. So customer asked for some 3 new features, and he said, okay, we will do it, but that will cost you extra licensing fee. And customer said, okay, I'll pay you extra licensing fee, but this was already planned as a next week upgrade. So in a week's time, we delivered it and said, look, you asked for it a week back, and look, it is here in a week. Now start paying us. So it is about how do we monetize our customers in a SaaS, especially in enterprise SaaS. I'm sure but enterprise SaaS, the funnel is not just this. Funnel goes like this, triangulate and then expand. So
Right.
essentially, you close the customer and then you expand within a customer. So it's a land and expand strategy. And for sales, for us, doesn't finish at the closure or first contract. First contract could be just a landing, just could be a foothold. A lot of sales happens post that
Yeah.
foothold, and I think so. We do what people call it as customer success and stuff like that. I think that is still a benchmark for us in terms of being a customer success oriented company. Because what we saw was that whenever we have a good customer success, the top of the funnel automatically increases. This is just because this is again a vertical enterprise SaaS, so people are networked. We have I'll give you a good sense of it. So if you go to LinkedIn and search for Bizome in job section, you will find somewhere like 20, 30,000 people who in their LinkedIn profile have said I am a Bizome expert or I have worked in Bizome.
Hmm.
So building that community of people who essentially are evangelizers of Bizome
Right.
was a interesting discovery for us, and that we did it through customer success. So putting it as for me,
Sure.
sales in an enterprise SaaS or vertical SaaS is a lot about customer success, not so much about the traditional model of building top of the funnel, moving it all of that. Obviously, we do a lot of it in a scale. So later, what we learned is that in an enterprise SaaS, another thing that is important is to have a very high quality feet on street. So like this colleague of mine, we have a team of people who can do consultative sales, who can
Right.
essentially not going into transactional sales, saying that look, you want this and you have this and stuff like that. Somebody goes with a or a big detailed understanding of the business processes and can do consultative sales. So then we created tools around that, what we call it as outcome mind map. So these are consultative sales tools that we actually invested in to create that, give that feet on street weapons to do that. And obviously that changed our way of hiring feet on street. In general, we don't have many. We have 6 feet on street for the whole business, but they are very high quality feet on street. They have a deep vertical understanding. They can hold a conversation with a head of sales or with a managing director of a multi-billion-dollar company and discuss distribution strategies or sales strategies with their not really ours. So they can actually handle that consultative sales far better. And then using that, even our customer success team is of business analysts or consultants who essentially help drive the growth for that end business.
Fantastic. Awesome. So now you have reached a certain scale of your business. Now, earlier you had a licensing model, and now you have it. You had an enterprise license model, and now and on the website you have moved it into a per user type of a model. So, was this a conscious choice? When did you make this change in your pricing models, and how did this affect your, or have an impact on your growth?
Actually, we always charge per user, but there is a significant change in the way we price it, and I'll tell you how. So initially, because we were so customer hungry, we would say that I will charge. You can pay me monthly. Very initially, even before the first 5 customers. What started happening was we got a lot of free pilots, but none of those pilots converted into any actual sales. This 5 lakh story worked really well for us, where we said, look, you pay me upfront. You pay me for a year minimum users, you pay me so much upfront. And that worked really well because we started seeing there is a skin in the game from the end customer point of view as well. And they also work with us as a partner to make that rollouts and the value addition and stuff like that happen. Okay. So that then became a habit that we said has to be a barrier for a customer to come in Bizom, because otherwise, if you want to work as a partner, if that barrier is not crossed, people will not. By the way, in COVID times, that barrier is also changing, but I'll come to that a little bit later. But yeah, so we said we're going to put a barrier to entry for each of our customers so that there is enough motivation on both the sides to make this particular rollout successful, because my money eventually is going to come from customer success. My money is going to come at the bottom of the funnel, not at when they start rollout. As a SaaS product, maybe somebody decide, let's say Unilever has a 30,000 feet on street in India.
Right.
If they sign up on Bizom, they're not going to they're not because the SaaS product, they maybe start with 300 in Bangalore, right? And then maybe go to all metros, then maybe go to all geographies, then maybe add their distributors on top of it. So it is a ongoing process. So we had to get that barrier to entry in place. That barrier to entry later became higher and higher and higher as we went up. So initially we started selling to SMEs, then we went up and started managed mid-market. Mid-market case studies pivoted us into large enterprise customers as well. And the pricing obviously kind of evolved with respect to that. Now today we said, look, for SMEs, it's always on a barrier, so to say, a minimum barrier. Otherwise, we will not onboard you, kind of a stuff. And on mid-market as well as enterprise, the pricing believes almost like so for them, they have a yearly budget. The key is to figure out what is that annual budget and how do you fit it in your SaaS pricing. So let's say if somebody has an annual budget of 4 crore or 8 crore for a specific need that they have, and then how do you fit your SaaS pricing within that? This is a combination of you charging a minimum user guarantee and an annual advance in general. So actually, I would put it that way. I mean, I moved from per user, which is a SME-oriented pricing,
Right,
to a more annual licensing for a minimum users of whatever 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, which ensures more, what do you call it, more predictable and stable revenues. Because as you know, in enterprises, while acquiring them is hard, churn is also very low. So
Right.
eventually the enterprise customers' revenues are far more stable, whereas SME could be an up and down all the way.
Fantastic. What's been your experience in when you talk to several other founders who sell globally SaaS solutions, and your SaaS solution sales experience in India?
Hmm.
So what do you see as a big fundamental difference there?
So again, for people who are starting out, if you have an option to sell in US, please sell in US. Uh, don't sell in India if you have an option, or if your DNA allows you to do that. Our DNA did not allow us to do that, so we ended up doing in India. So selling in India is hard in general because the uh, Indian enterprise are very value conscious. Let me put it that way. They're not cost conscious; they're value conscious. Whereas, for example, an American customer or whatever, I have little bit understanding I have, even if a 70-80% of their problem is getting solved, they will pay you money and move on quickly. In India, the guy will not pay you money and move on till his 100% of his problem is solved, and that could make that whole sales and onboarding process very hard. But at the same time, because you are solving 100% of the problem, your churn is also fairly low, because unlikely that another person who's going to take that same amount of effort to do that. In a recurring model, it works well because even if you may not make net money because your cost of onboarding and cost of acquisition is fairly high, next year or 3 years down the line, you will surely make a lot of money. And somebody getting in is also very hard in such customers in general, right? So that's the general difference. So if you have a choice, so let's put it that way: America, US, or Northern America or Western Europe, your cost of acquisition will be fairly high, or CSC payback periods would be fairly low. In places like India, once you build a basic word of mouth, a basic network effect, your cost of acquisition will dramatically come down, but cost of onboarding could be high till a point you kind of get deeper into that particular account. So cost of onboarding is typically higher in Indian markets than in US markets. I'll put it that way. Yeah, as I was saying, I think India Enterprise and US SME are two very proven models as of today. What I see in SaaS, India. When I say India Enterprise, I mean emerging market enterprise. But
Right.
emerging market enterprise. So I see two SaaS successful or other reasonably successful SaaS companies in one of those two kind of buckets: emerging market enterprise
Sure.
and US SME. US enterprise, it's a little bit harder to execute, and India SME is also even hard to execute. But I have some case examples of that as well, but lesser, I would say.
Sure. So talk to us a little bit about your your recent global expansion that you have initiated, and what's your strategy there. You're completely entering new markets. You're expanding with your current customers into newer areas, or and how has a lot of these things changed during this COVID time?
Yeah, of course, now we can't travel. It's a good thing is our travel costs come down phenomenally. Everybody is happy to do Zoom calls, so that's phenomenal. That saves me time a lot. I can do like 10 meetings in a day, which was impossible to do pre-COVID. Pre-COVID in Bangalore, if you know, I could if we could do 2 meetings in a day, I would be happy
Right.
because of all the travel and stuff. But yeah, so that aside, our international sales essentially, again, as a focus, as a principle, it hasn't changed. It is just saying inch wide and mile deep. So the inch that we picked there are about, so we have about 60 odd large enterprise MNC logos whom we have onboarded in India. Uh, the likes of Reckitt and Hershey's and Pepsi and Coke and stuff like that, right? Now these guys have worldwide operations, and their problems in India are similar to their problems in other emerging markets. Also, India itself is the most complex for them as far as sales and distribution is concerned. So if you know, our retail density is the largest in world, right? So we have one retailer
Right.
per 80 people, which is like about one retailer per 20 households in general. So for every 20 apartments or 20 houses you see, there is a one retailer shop there. But most complex to distribute or rather sell through such a fragmented retail ecosystem. So and every brand understands that if something works in India, it is very easy to copy it to rest of the world because those problems are lesser there. For example, replicating India model in Indonesia is far easier, or replicating India model in Egypt is far easier. Because if it works in India, it should work. It must work in Egypt. So our international strategy was simply saying that take those logos that we have already kind of acquired and proven in India, and expand to their rest of the emerging market geographies. And for that, we needed to be closer to their worldwide headquarters, and we needed to have a presence to be able to build those central relationships. And as I said, to do consultative sales and stuff like that. So our UK strategy is fairly simple, where we have a very high quality team, somebody who's been like doing retail distribution strategy for likes of Unilever and Diageo and PMC for over 20 years. So this gentleman comes and joins us and helps us sell into some of those enterprises to help us fast speed up the rollouts worldwide. Other age we have chosen is markets like Africa. There are multiple reasons for it. One of the things is obviously this during the COVID time, Africa as a continent is the least affected among
Correct.
continents. Their this thing is fairly low. So interestingly enough, they are even so in last 3 months where India enterprises are very engaged and taking time to make their decisions. We have closed three large deals in Africa. So this is quite interesting. So that's why we choose Africa. We have enough case studies there, enough word of mouth, and there are those. But we don't need to be physically present in Africa to do that either, and that's another thing that works for us. We have a channel partner who takes care of that. So those are the international basic tenets of international. Take India enterprise, go worldwide in their rollout, and pick another inch in Africa and be a market leader there.
Fantastic. This is a great strategy where you expand along with your existing customers who have global operations, and then go deep into and grow
If you
with
don't
them.
know how to do sales, this works.
Yeah, that's a great hack for enterprise sales. Fantastic. Uh, as we come to closer to the Q&A section, I want you to share some of your key learnings that you advise now to newer B2B SaaS companies, as to what would be some 2, 3 strategies that you would tell them to look at, apart from inch wide, dig deep.
Okay, so this is going to be a controversial thing because it's quite opposite to what a lot of VCs or other entrepreneurs would recommend. But this is what I firmly
Sure.
believe in. I think there is a lot of, so let's say people call themselves enterprise SaaS company, and the first sales they try to do is to Unilever or to a billion-dollar company. So it could work if you're ex Unilever, but even then, how will you replicate it into another account is a very hard thing to do. I think that this kind of a thinking makes you a services company rather than a product company. You end up doing a lot of custom services because large enterprises are going to need a lot of this onboarding, customization, stuff like that, and your product is not yet proven. So you're going to end up building like 100 products for 100 different customers. So I tell people not
Yeah.
to not to do that. Honestly, when you're starting out, even if you're an enterprise product, when you're starting out, sell it to SMEs. They're easier to acquire. There is a lesser cost of sales, and second is because SMEs don't pay you so much money, you're forced to build a product that scales. Your onboarding costs, your cost configurations and other stuff becomes out of the box. I mean, when we are beating the larger incumbents in our space, we know that the reason for their sluggishness or slowness is because they don't have this kind of a product. So your product building journey becomes faster if you're selling to SMEs first and getting the product market fit, because you can't just afford to do customizations like that. Uh, if you
Right.
from day one, if you start going into enterprises, you will end up being a customization services company in the garb of with the face of SaaS company. And I see so many of them right now. It's not funny. So that would be first thought process or advice. Second, obviously, and I think I mentioned that multiple times, but if you are a techie like me, get out of that comfort zone, start talking to customers, get abused on cold calls, make yourself vulnerable, make those stupid pricing deals which you wouldn't do otherwise. I think that helps to get a sense of realism of an overall business as well as the product potential, which you wouldn't get when you're sitting in office and directing your sales guys saying, why couldn't you sell it at this much price, or why couldn't you sell it at this terms, and what is the use of you being a sales guy if you can't do this? If you try yourself, try and sell few things, you get that realism and sense of uh, balance in your when you are eventually directing your sales and marketing process.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you so much, Lalit. Some great insights. Thanks for sharing your sales journey and how you took Bizom to the current scale of operations. Fantastic. All right. We have the first one coming. This is from Vinay. What's your advice on starting up and learning during your first failed attempts of your entrepreneur journey?
First of all, I was very distraught when I thought I'd failed first. So my advice would be kind of forgive yourself to start with. I think without that there is no progress if you do that. So I think that was my first learning, that just don't be so intense, that don't be like my life has come to end if I fail as a the startup fails, the entrepreneur doesn't fail. That's the whole part. So start on a new idea and hopefully that will be successful, right? And second, I think I explained a little bit better. At least the learning I took was that I wanted to focus on a customer group that I understand. So I needed to talk to customers a little bit more, and that's why I chose India Enterprise as a segment, because that is something I could get to my user journey faster than US. So be talk more to customers. Whether two basic learnings in the first two attempts. Yeah.
Next question is from Alpana. How did you overcome the fear of failure before you're starting up, and how do you get those guts insights right away?
No, you don't need guts. First of all, if you haven't started up yet, my sincere advice to you not to start up at all, uh, because it's not a. So if you are looking at it from a ROI point of view, even if I get a whatever multi-billion-dollar exit, I don't think from pure cash point of view there will be an ROI. I could have possibly made more money by doing a job. So if you are doing it for money reasons, please don't do it. I would look at it this way, that if you want to be an entrepreneur, you have to be a little bit mad or a little bit crazy. So if you are crazy, then you would already know it, and you would already be doing something or trying your luck at it. So there is no fear of failure as such. It's just the amount of madness you have to not take logical decisions. So starting a business or being an entrepreneur when you have a job is not a logical decision. So if you leave the logic aside, if you can leave the logic aside, only then think about starting if you want to. So my advice in general, anybody comes and asks me, should I start? I said no, don't start. If you have that question, means there is no point in you starting. Just if you already started, then I'll tell you not to give up. But if you have not started, don't start.
How did you find your co-founder and your views on hiring a team?
Right. So I have two co-founders, Vasu and Shri. One of them was very easy. She is married to me, so I found one co-founder at home. Again, that's not something I would not recommend doing that. Don't try this at home. It needs these stunts are performed under expert guidance, so don't do this. But I ended up doing this. Okay, so that was easier or tougher. So way I did it was like this. When my first, so she wasn't. So I had a different bunch of co-founders at the first attempt, and all four, five of us decided to quit startup and join jobs. My four co-founders could write resume; they were hireable, so to say. I was completely unemployable. I could not even write my resume or tell anybody else. So then I said, I'll continue. And those four guys were nice enough to say, Lalit, here is a stock back, and you find different set of co-founders. That's it.